That over the past few years, I have been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in this stride toward freedom is not the White Citizens Council or the Ku Klux Klan, but the white moderate, who's more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with you. I agree with the goal you seek, but I can't agree with your methods of direct action. Lukewarm acceptance, King said, is much more bewildering than outright rejection. Now, he saves the harshest words for the likes of you and me, for people of faith. Listen to just a little more and allow the weight of his words to press down upon us this morning. He says, let me take note of my other major disappointment. I've been so greatly disappointed with the white church and its leadership. Now, I do wonder today if he were alive today, if he would add the synagogue and the mosque and the temple to his list of moderate religious institutions. But for now, let's just stick to his words. Too many have been more cautious than courageous and have remained silent behind the anesthetizing security of stained glass windows. On sweltering summer days and crisp autumn mornings, I have looked at the South's beautiful churches with their lofty spires pointing heavenward. I have beheld the impressive outlines of her massive religious education buildings. Over and over, I have found myself asking, what kind of people worship here? Who is their God? Where were their voices when the lips of Governor Barnett dripped with words of interposition and nullification? Where were they when Governor Wallace gave a clarion call for defiance and hatred? Where were their voices of support when bruised and weary Negro men and women decided to rise up from the dark dungeons of complacency to the bright hills of creative protest? Yes, these are the questions that are still in my mind. In deep disappointment, I have wept over the laxity of the church, but be assured that my tears have been tears of love. There can be no disappointment where there is not also deep love. Yes, I love the church. How could I do otherwise? But oh, how we have blemished and scarred that body through social neglect and through fear of being nonconformists. Over 50 years now, and that still rings in part tragically true. Now I know there are signs of hope all around us. I've been in many churches, in many of your churches, and synagogues, and mosques, and temples, where moral courage and moral action are as integral to the religious experience as our prayers and worship. I have witnessed firsthand the new and the building tide of an interreligious movement for justice in this country. I've seen and worked with some of your feeding programs and tutoring and after-school programs. I've sat with some of you who are organizing for the sake of justice in Morris County and beyond, and see the signs that I believe would make Dr. King proud. But we all know that the forces of fatigue and normalization will not be easily overcome. It will require resolve, resiliency, commitment, and a willingness to risk. Perhaps status, respectability, financial comfort, the support of congregations even, if the dream is to live in us and among us. Now, in the early days of the civil rights movement, the Reverend Ralph Abernathy, Martin Luther King's closest confidant and collaborator, stood in a Selma pulpit while he knew that the local police were recording his sermon. He told this simple and uproariously hilarious story about a hired hand who decided to call his white boss by his first name, something unheard of in the Jim Crow South. This is how he tells the story. The boss man said, "Now, Charlie, what's wrong with you? Have you lost your mind or something?" And Charlie said, "No, I haven't lost my mind." "Well, I know you've lost your mind, Charlie. You've worked for me for 40 years, and you've been faithful. Let me know if you've been sick so I can take you to the doctor." Abernathy is mimicking the boss's phony and solicitous style of speech. And Charlie says, "No, I'm not sick. I've never felt better. But you know, the Freedom Riders, they done come through town, and they done told us, John," more hilarious laughing from the congregation, "they done told us, John, that I'm just as good as you. I want you to tell Ann," more hilarious laughing from the congregation, "I want you to tell Ann that from now on there's not going to be any Mr. John or Miss Ann. In fact, there's not going to be Miss anything. It's not even going to be Mississippi. From now on, it's just going to be plain old Sippy." Downtown to Sheriff Clark that Negroes are not afraid of him. He can come out and he can wave his stick all he wants. He can push us and he can shove us, but we're not afraid. We're going to stand our ground, John. And it's that line that I want you to remember today. We're going to stand our ground. We're going to stand our ground for justice in Morris County. We're going to stand our ground for the poor, for the immigrant, for the profiled, for the othered. We're going to stand our ground against fatigue and the normalizing of hate. We're going to stand our ground that religion is and can be and should be the strongest force for good and for love and for dreaming a new world into being rather than a force that separates. We won't cede that ground, and we will use the great traditions and resources of our faiths for the well-being and the thriving of all. We're going to stand